In the marble corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of secrets echo in every footstep, a single moment can change everything. When the weight of a crown becomes too heavy to bear alone, even kings must reach for something real. But in a world where every gesture is watched, every touch analyzed, and every emotion dissected by millions, what happens when human need collides with royal duty? Behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the crowds, three people stand at the crossroads of love, loyalty, and legacy. Charles, burdened by the expectations of a nation, still mourning his mother. Kate, struggling to find her place in an institution that seems determined to reshape her. And Camilla, the woman who has waited decades to claim her rightful place, now watching as the very foundation of her world threatens to shift. Some moments are too raw for headlines, too intimate for history books. This is the story of one such moment. When a king forgot his crown, a future queen remembered her humanity, and the woman who had everything to lose discovered what it truly means to love without condition. The grandfather clock in the blue drawing room struck 11, its deep chimes rolling through the empty corridors of Windsor Castle like distant thunder. Charles stood at the tall windows, his silhouette carved against the pale morning light that filtered through the ancient glass. His hands, weathered by 7 decades of life and 6 months of kingship, pressed against the cool window frame as he watched the ground spread endlessly before him. The weight on his shoulders felt heavier today than the crown he had worn during his coronation. That golden circle of metal and jewels had been a burden he had prepared for his entire life, but this weight was different. It pressed against his chest, making each breath feel deliberate and difficult. The papers scattered across the mahogany desk behind him told a story he was not ready to face. Approval ratings that declined with each passing week, a public that mourned his mother more than they celebrated his reign, and a family fracturing under the pressure of constant scrutiny. Kate moved through the castle's long corridor with practiced grace, her heels clicking a steady rhythm against the polished marble floors. The sound echoed in the vastness, a lonely percussion that seemed to emphasize the emptiness around her. She had learned to walk these halls like a ghost, present but unnoticed, always aware that even in the privacy of their home, eyes were watching and ears were listening. The staff moved with respectful efficiency, their trained gazes never lingering too long on the Princess of Wales as she made her way toward the blue drawing room. She paused at the doorway, observing Charles through the crack in the door. His shoulders, usually held with military precision, sagged under an invisible burden. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, making him look older than his years, more fragile than the public ever saw. In this moment, he was not the King of England, not the head of the Commonwealth, not the symbol of an enduring monarchy. He was simply a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. The newspapers that morning had been particularly cruel. The headlines screamed about his every misstep, comparing him unfavorably to his mother at every turn. Elizabeth had ruled for 70 years, becoming as permanent and reliable as the changing seasons. Charles had ruled for mere months, and already the cracks in his foundation were showing. The press seemed to take particular pleasure in highlighting every stumble, every uncertain moment, every sign that perhaps he was not the king the nation needed. Kate understood this burden in ways that few others could. She had entered this world as an outsider, a middle-class girl who had fallen in love with a prince and found herself transformed into something she barely recognized. The process had been gradual, but relentless. Years of training and protocol in the art of saying nothing while appearing engaged, in the delicate balance of being human while serving as a symbol. She had watched William navigate the same transformation, had seen how the weight of expectation could crush spontaneity and turn genuine emotion into calculated performance. But Charles's burden was different, heavier. He had lived his entire life waiting for this role, preparing for a moment that came too late and under circumstances that made celebration impossible. He had become king not in triumph, but in grief, not as a young man ready to shape the future, but as an older man inheriting a legacy that seemed impossible to match. Every day brought new challenges that his mother had handled with apparent ease, decisions that carried the weight of centuries and the expectations of millions. The morning had brought news of another crisis brewing in Parliament, rumors of discontent within his own government, whispers that perhaps the monarchy itself was becoming an anachronism in the modern world. Charles had read each report with growing despair, watching his life's work and his mother's legacy threatened by forces that seemed beyond his ability to control. The careful balance that Elizabeth had maintained for decades was crumbling, and he felt helpless to stop it. Kate stepped into the room, her presence announced by the soft whisper of her dress against the doorframe. Charles did not turn, but she saw his shoulders tighten slightly, the subtle shift that indicated his awareness of her arrival. The room felt heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of shared understanding that came from living under the same impossible pressures. She approached slowly, her training in royal protocol warring with her instinct to reach out as a friend, as family, as someone who understood the particular loneliness of their position. The rules that governed their lives were complex and unforgiving, every interaction scrutinized, every gesture analyzed for hidden meaning, every moment of genuine human connection filtered through the lens of public perception and political implication. The silence stretched between them, filled with the subtle sounds of the castle around them, the distant murmur of staff going about their duties, the whisper of wind through ancient stones, the soft tick of clocks marking time in a place where tradition moved slower than the modern world demanded. Charles remained at the window, his gaze fixed on the grounds where tourists gathered at the gates, their cameras pointed toward windows behind which the most powerful family in Britain lived lives of carefully orchestrated isolation. Kate understood his silence. Words had become dangerous things in their world, likely to be misinterpreted or taken out of context. Even private conversations carried the risk of public exposure, of staff members with selective hearing and flexible loyalty. The art of communication had become a careful dance of implication and suggestion, of meaning conveyed through glance and gesture rather than direct statement. She moved closer, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the window frame as though it were an anchor in a storm. Up close, she could see the signs of sleepless nights that makeup and careful lighting usually conceal from public view. The burden of the crown had aged him in ways that years of waiting never had, carving new lines around his eyes and adding a tremor to his hands that had not been there during his mother's lifetime. The weight of their shared silence grew heavier, filled with all the things that could not be said, all the support that could not be offered, all the human connection that protocol and politics made impossible. Kate felt the familiar frustration that came with loving people she was not permitted to comfort, with being part of family that was also a corporation, an institution that valued image over emotion and duty over individual need. Charles finally moved, turning slightly from the window, though his gaze remained fixed on the world beyond the glass. The movement was small, but significant, an acknowledgement of her presence that did not require words or gestures that might be observed and misinterpreted. In their world of constant surveillance, even the smallest acts of human connection carried risk. The morning light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, casting the room in alternating patterns of brightness and shadow. The change seemed to emphasize the isolation of their position, the way they lived always between light and darkness, between public adoration and private despair, between the roles they were required to play and the people they actually were beneath the titles and expectations. Kate found herself thinking of her children, of George and Charlotte and Louis, who were growing up in this strange world of privilege and pressure. She wondered how they would handle the burden when their time came, whether they would find the strength that Charles was struggling to maintain, whether they would be able to preserve some essential part of themselves in a role that demanded everything and gave so little in return. The silence continued, but it had changed somehow, becoming less about isolation and more about shared understanding. They stood together in the weight of their impossible situation, two people bound by duty and affection and the peculiar loneliness of lives lived in the public eye. Neither spoke, but neither moved away, finding in their shared presence a small measure of comfort in a world that offered precious little genuine human connection. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed softly in the corridor beyond the blue drawing room, measured and deliberate, carrying the familiar rhythm that both Charles and Kate had learned to recognize. Camilla's presence always announced itself with this particular cadence, confident but not hurried, purposeful but respectful of the spaces she entered. After decades of navigating the complex dynamics of royal life, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional temperature of any room before she entered it. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the ornate door handle as she observed the scene before her. Years of experience had taught her to assess situations quickly and accurately. Charles stood frozen at the window, his body language speaking of exhaustion and defeat in ways that his words never would. Kate maintained her position nearby, close enough to offer support, but far enough to respect the invisible boundaries that governed their interactions. The air in the room felt thick with unspoken tension and shared burden. Camilla had spent the morning in her own suite of rooms, dealing with her correspondence and reviewing the schedule of engagements that stretched endlessly into the future. Each appearance, each speech, each public moment was carefully choreographed to project strength and stability. But she had also read the morning papers, had seen the harsh criticism that seemed to grow more pointed with each passing day. The honeymoon period that traditionally followed a new reign had been cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control, and the pressure was beginning to show on all of them. The relationship between the three of them had evolved over years of careful navigation through personal and public challenges. What had once been awkward and politically fraught had gradually transformed into something more complex and genuine. Kate had entered their world as the wife of the heir apparent, bringing with her fresh perspectives and a connection to modern Britain that the family desperately needed. Camilla had waited decades for her position to be officially recognized, enduring years of public hostility and private uncertainty before finally achieving acceptance. Now, watching Charles struggle with burdens that seemed to grow heavier each day, both women understood that their roles extended far beyond the official duties outlined in constitutional documents. They were the people closest to a man who carried the weight of an ancient institution on shoulders that were more human than the public ever realized. The question was how to offer support in a world where every gesture was scrutinized and every relationship was filtered through the lens of political implication. Charles moved away from the window, finally, turning to acknowledge Kate's presence with a nod that conveyed gratitude without requiring words. His eyes, usually bright with interest and engagement, appeared dulled by the weight of recent pressures. The morning meetings with his private secretaries had been particularly difficult, filled with discussions of declining poll numbers and growing questions about the monarchy's relevance in contemporary society. Each statistic felt like a personal failure, each criticism a reflection of his inadequacy compared to the woman who had preceded him. The burden of comparison was perhaps the heaviest weight he carried. Elizabeth had been 25 when she became queen, young enough to grow into the role and to evolve with her times. She had ruled through decades of social transformation, adapting the monarchy to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. Charles had become king at 73, his personality and perspectives already formed, his relationship with the public complicated by decades of scrutiny and misunderstanding. Kate understood this burden because she had faced her own version of it. From the moment her relationship with William became public, she had been compared to Diana, measured against a standard that was both impossible to meet and dangerous to attempt. The media had dissected every choice she made, from her fashion selections to her charitable interests, always looking for signs that she was either too different from her predecessor or too obviously trying to emulate her. The process of finding her own identity within the confines of royal protocol had been gradual and often painful. She had learned to navigate the space between authenticity and appropriate behavior, between genuine emotion and required composure. The public saw the polished result of years of careful development. But she remembered the early days when every appearance felt like a performance she was not quite qualified to give. Camilla stepped into the room, her entrance marking a shift in the dynamics. Her presence brought with it decades of experience in handling royal crises, in managing public perception, in finding ways to support Charles through the challenges that came with his position. She had stood by him through scandals and celebrations, through periods of public hostility and gradual acceptance, learning to read his moods and needs with the accuracy that came from deep understanding and genuine care. The three of them formed an unlikely triangle in the Grand Room, each bringing their own perspective to the shared challenge of maintaining an institution that sometimes felt increasingly disconnected from the world it was meant to serve. Charles carried the ultimate responsibility, but lacked the training in modern communication that his situation demanded. Kate brought fresh insights and public appeal, but was still learning to navigate the complex protocols that governed royal behavior. Camilla offered experience and unwavering loyalty, but carried the burden of a public image that had only recently transformed from liability to asset. The morning light continued to shift as clouds moved across the sky, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that seemed to reflect the uncertain nature of their current situation. The challenges they faced were not temporary crises that could be managed with traditional approaches. They represented fundamental questions about the role of monarchy in contemporary society, about the balance between tradition and adaptation, about the possibility of maintaining relevance while preserving essential character. Charles moved toward his desk, where the morning papers lay scattered alongside official documents and personal correspondence. Each headline seemed designed to inflict maximum damage, questioning not just his competence, but his very fitness for the role he had waited his entire life to fulfill. The criticism cut deeper than public attacks usually did, because much of it came from sources that had previously supported the monarchy and the royal family. Kate watched him approach the papers with something approaching dread, understanding that each reading session added to his burden rather than providing information that might help him address the challenges he faced. The modern news cycle demanded constant response and engagement, but royal protocol required measured consideration and careful consultation before any public statement could be made. The result was a perpetual lag between crisis and response that made every situation appear more damaging than it might otherwise be. Camilla recognized the signs of her husband's growing despair and understood that traditional approaches to royal crisis management were proving inadequate to their current situation. The careful distance that had protected the monarchy for generations was now being interpreted as indifference or incompetence. The public demanded accessibility and authenticity, but the institution was designed around ceremony and controlled interaction. The silence in the room grew heavier as each of them contemplated their shared challenge from their individual perspectives. They were bound together not just by family relationships and official positions, but by their commitment to an institution that was larger than any of them individually. Yet that same institution sometimes seemed to constrain their ability to address the very problems that threatened its future. Charles looked up from the papers, his gaze moving between Kate and Camilla, seeing in their faces the reflection of his own concerns and uncertainties. These were the people who knew him best, who understood both his strengths and his limitations, who had stood by him through previous challenges, and who would continue to do so regardless of what the future might bring. But he also saw in their expressions the weight of their own burdens, their own struggles to maintain their roles while preserving their essential humanity. The moments stretched between them, filled with the complexity of their situation and the depth of their shared commitment. They stood at a crossroads where personal need met institutional requirement, where human emotion confronted royal protocol, where the desire to connect authentically battled against the necessity of maintaining appropriate boundaries. In the silence, each of them grappled with the question of how to move forward when the traditional rules no longer seemed adequate to their circumstances. Something in Charles's expression shifted as he looked away from the newspapers, the mask of royal composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated pressure. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them flat on the desk surface, and, for a moment, the careful control that had been drilled into him since childhood threatened to abandon him entirely. The king who had spent 73 years preparing for this role suddenly looked like a man who was drowning in expectations he could never hope to meet. Kate saw the change before Camilla did, recognizing the signs from her own moments of overwhelming pressure. She had experienced her own version of this breaking point during the early years of her marriage, when the weight of public scrutiny and the demands of royal life had seemed impossible to bear. The difference was that her struggles had been largely private, hidden from public view by careful scheduling and protective family members. Charles carried his burden in full view of a nation that seemed determined to document every sign of weakness or uncertainty. The realization that he was struggling hit Kate with unexpected force. This man who had been a constant presence in her life for over a decade, who had welcomed her into his family with genuine warmth and support, was facing a crisis that threatened everything he had worked toward his entire life. The public saw a king who had inherited unprecedented wealth and privilege. She saw a father and grandfather who was watching his legacy and his family's future threatened by forces beyond his control. Without conscious thought, Kate took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Royal protocol dictated careful boundaries in all interactions, especially those that might be observed by staff members whose loyalty could never be completely assured. Physical contact was particularly restricted, limited to formal occasions when specific gestures were required by ceremony or tradition. Even private family interactions were governed by unwritten rules that had been developed over generations to protect the monarchy from scandal or misinterpretation. But in this moment, protocol seemed less important than human need. Kate could see that Charles was reaching a breaking point where the burden of his position was becoming literally unbearable. The man who had spent decades learning to carry himself with dignity and authority was crumbling under pressures that no amount of training or preparation had adequately prepared him to handle. She understood that sometimes the most important thing was not following rules, but responding to genuine human crisis with genuine human compassion. Charles looked up as Kate approached, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability that he rarely allowed anyone to see. The careful mask of royal authority had slipped completely now, revealing the frightened and exhausted man beneath the crown. He had spent his entire life being told that he must never show weakness, never admit uncertainty, never allow the public to see him as anything other than completely confident and in control. But the cost of that constant performance was becoming too high to bear. Kate reached out without hesitation, her hand finding his shoulder with a gesture that was both natural and revolutionary in their carefully controlled world. The simple human contact carried years of shared experience and mutual support, acknowledging the reality that they were all struggling with impossible demands while trying to preserve their essential humanity. Her touch was gentle but firm, offering the kind of authentic comfort that royal life rarely permitted. The gesture was witnessed by Camilla, who had moved closer during their silent interaction. For a moment, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Gratitude that someone was offering Charles the support he desperately needed, combined with a protective instinct that had been honed over decades of standing by his side through various crises. She understood better than anyone the pressures he faced and the toll they were taking on his health and spirit. Charles did not pull away from Kate's touch, instead seeming to draw strength from the simple human connection. The gesture reminded him that beneath all the titles and protocols, they were a family bound together by genuine affection and shared commitment. Kate's willingness to breach protocol in order to offer comfort spoke to the depth of their relationship and her understanding of what he was enduring. The moment stretched between them, heavy with significance that went far beyond the simple physical contact. In a world where every interaction was calculated for public consumption and political effect, this spontaneous gesture of support represented something rare and precious, authentic human connection that existed independent of official roles and constitutional requirements. Kate's hand on Charles's shoulder acknowledged his struggle, while offering the kind of unconditional support that royal life too often made impossible. Camilla watched the interaction with growing understanding of its importance. She had spent decades learning to navigate the complex dynamics of royal relationships, where personal feelings were always filtered through institutional considerations. The sight of Kate offering Charles such direct comfort reminded her that their unusual family had developed bonds that transcended traditional royal protocols. They had found ways to care for each other that honored both their personal relationships and their public responsibilities. The silence in the room had transformed from heavy with tension to profound with shared understanding. Charles gradually straightened under Kate's touch, drawing on the strength that her gesture offered. The simple act of physical comfort reminded him that he was not facing his challenges alone, that there were people who understood his struggle and were willing to support him regardless of public opinion or political calculation. Kate maintained her position, her hand steady on his shoulder, offering continued support while being careful not to make the gesture more significant than it needed to be. She understood that Charles needed time to process both his emotions and the comfort being offered. Her own experience with overwhelming pressure had taught her the importance of allowing people to accept help at their own pace, without judgment or expectation. Camilla stepped forward slightly, creating a triangle of connection in the grand room. Her movement was deliberate and supportive, indicating her approval of Kate's gesture and her own willingness to participate in whatever support Charles needed. The three of them formed a unit in that moment, bound together by their shared commitment to each other and to the institution they served, but prioritizing human need over institutional protocol. Charles slowly reached up to cover Kate's hand with his own, a gesture that acknowledged and accepted the comfort she was offering. The simple contact between their hands represented a breakthrough in their relationship, a willingness to prioritize authentic connection over the careful distance that royal life usually required. His touch was gentle but grateful, conveying emotions that words could not safely express in their carefully monitored world. The gesture created a moment of genuine intimacy in a life that offered few opportunities for such connection. Charles had spent decades learning to maintain appropriate boundaries with family members who were also constitutional figures in their own right. The weight of their official roles often made it difficult to express or accept the kind of support that family members typically provided for each other during times of crisis. Camilla felt a profound shift in the dynamics of their relationship as she witnessed this moment of authentic connection between Charles and Kate. For years, she had struggled with the complex dynamics of being both Charles's wife and a member of the royal family, trying to balance her desire to support him personally with the requirements of her official position. Seeing Kate break through those barriers with such natural grace made her realize that their family had evolved beyond traditional royal constraints. The morning light continued to filter through the tall windows, creating an atmosphere that felt both intimate and significant. The three of them stood connected in a way that transcended their official roles, finding in their shared humanity a strength that protocol and tradition alone could never provide. The moment represented a fundamental shift in how they would support each other through the challenges that lay ahead, prioritizing genuine care over institutional requirements. Charles's shoulders gradually relaxed under the support being offered, his breathing becoming deeper and more regular as the immediate crisis passed. The touch of Kate's hand reminded him that strength could come from accepting help as well as from maintaining independence. That leadership could sometimes mean acknowledging vulnerability rather than projecting constant authority. The lesson was one that his training had never provided, but which his current circumstances desperately required. Camilla watched the tender exchange between Charles and Kate with emotions that surprised her in their complexity and depth. For decades, she had been the primary source of emotional support for Charles, standing by him through scandals and triumphs, offering strength when the weight of expectation threatened to crush him. She had fought for her place in his life against public opposition and institutional resistance, finally achieving acceptance and recognition after years of patience and perseverance. Now, witnessing Kate offer the same kind of unconditional support, she felt not jealousy, but profound gratitude. The realization came slowly, but with complete clarity. This was not about replacement or competition, but about expansion. Charles needed more support than any one person could provide, facing pressures that were unprecedented in their intensity and complexity. The modern monarchy required different approaches to crisis management and public engagement, approaches that benefited from multiple perspectives and varied strengths. Kate brought to their family dynamic a natural warmth and accessibility that complemented Camilla's experience and Charles's deep knowledge of constitutional matters. Camilla stepped forward, moving to Charles's other side in a gesture that transformed their configuration from a triangle into a line of support. Her movement was deliberate and meaningful, indicating her full endorsement of the comfort Kate was providing while adding her own presence to the circle of care surrounding her husband. The positioning was symbolic, but also practical, creating a physical manifestation of their united commitment to helping Charles navigate the challenges he faced. As she moved closer, Camilla placed her own hand gently on Charles's back, offering additional support while acknowledging the importance of Kate's initial gesture. The touch was familiar and practiced, born of decades of providing comfort during difficult moments, but it carried new significance in this context. By joining Kate in offering physical comfort, she was acknowledging a new dynamic in their family relationships, one that prioritized Charles's well-being over traditional hierarchies or territorial concerns. Charles felt the additional support and understood its significance immediately. Camilla's willingness to share the role of primary supporter rather than claiming exclusive right to comfort him represented a fundamental shift in how their family would function. He was surrounded now by two strong women who understood his burdens and were committed to helping him bear them, regardless of protocol or conventional expectations about royal relationships. The three of them stood together in a moment of unprecedented intimacy and mutual support. The blue drawing room, which had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies and constitutional discussions, now held a scene that would never appear in official histories, but which was perhaps more significant than many events that would. Three people bound by duty and affection had chosen to prioritize human connection over institutional protocol, creating a foundation for facing future challenges with greater strength and unity. Kate felt the shift in dynamics as Camilla joined their circle of support, understanding that something important was being established in this moment. The careful boundaries that had always existed in their relationships were being redrawn based on genuine need and authentic care rather than on traditional hierarchies. She had always respected Camilla's position as Charles's wife and longest supporter, but now she understood that their family had evolved beyond such simple definitions. The silence that surrounded them was no longer heavy with unspoken tension, but peaceful with shared understanding. Charles gradually straightened, drawing strength from both women while maintaining the physical connection that anchored him in this moment of vulnerability. The immediate crisis had passed, but the deeper transformation was just beginning. They had discovered a new way of supporting each other that honored both their personal relationships and their institutional responsibilities. Camilla's perspective on her role within the family began to shift as she stood supporting Charles alongside Kate. For years, she had felt the burden of being his primary emotional support, carrying the weight of his struggles while managing her own public challenges and personal adjustments to royal life. The presence of another woman equally committed to his well-being did not diminish her importance, but rather shared the load in ways she had not previously imagined possible. She began to see Kate not as a younger rival or a threat to her position, but as a partner in the complex task of supporting a man who carried impossible burdens. Kate's natural warmth and public appeal complemented her own experience and institutional knowledge. Together, they could provide Charles with the very types of support he needed to navigate both personal challenges and constitutional crises. The realization brought a sense of relief that surprised her with its intensity. Charles slowly lifted his head, looking first at Kate and then at Camilla, seeing in their faces a reflection of the love and commitment that had sustained him through previous challenges and would continue to do so in the difficult times ahead. The gesture of support they had offered represented more than temporary comfort. It established a new foundation for how they would face the future together. He understood that he was not alone in carrying the burden of the crown, that he had allies who would stand with him regardless of public opinion or political pressure. The morning light had shifted again, filling the room with a warmer glow that seemed to reflect the transformation taking place within their relationships. The newspapers on the desk no longer seemed as threatening. The challenges ahead, no less daunting, but somehow more manageable with the knowledge that he would not face them in isolation. The support of these two women reminded him that strength could come from acknowledging vulnerability, that leadership could be enhanced rather than diminished by accepting help. Kate maintained her position, understanding instinctively that Charles needed time to fully process both the comfort being offered and his own willingness to accept it. Her experience with the pressures of royal life had taught her the importance of allowing people to find their own balance between independence and interdependence. The gesture she had initiated had grown into something larger and more significant, but she was careful not to make more of the moment than Charles was ready to handle. Camilla felt a profound sense of completion as she stood supporting Charles alongside Kate. The complex dynamics that had defined their family relationships for years had resolved into something simpler and more authentic. She no longer felt the need to prove her importance or defend her position. Instead, she could focus entirely on providing the kind of support that Charles needed, secure in the knowledge that Kate shared her commitment and would work alongside her rather than in competition with her. The moment began to naturally conclude as Charles straightened fully, drawing final strength from their touch before gently indicating his readiness to face the day ahead. The crisis had passed, but the transformation was permanent. They had established a new way of caring for each other that would influence how they handled future challenges. The unconditional support they had offered and received would become a foundation for navigating the complex demands of royal life while preserving their essential humanity. As they slowly separated, each returning to their individual space within the room, the atmosphere remained charged with the significance of what had occurred. They had crossed boundaries that could never be uncrossed, had established connections that would endure beyond this particular crisis. The blue drawing room held the secret of their transformation, a moment of authentic human connection that existed independent of their public roles and constitutional duties. Charles moved back toward the windows, but his posture had changed completely. The weight on his shoulders remained, but it was no longer unbearable because it was no longer carried alone. Kate and Camilla had shown him that accepting support was not a sign of weakness, but a recognition of the reality that some burdens were too heavy for any one person to bear. The crown might be his to wear, but the responsibility it represented could be shared among people who understood both its weight and its importance. The transformation was complete, but subtle, visible only in the relaxation of Charles's shoulders, the steadiness of his breathing, and the renewed clarity in his eyes. He had been reminded that beneath all the titles and protocols, he was part of a family that would stand with him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The support of Kate and Camilla had not solved his problems, but it had given him the strength to face them with renewed confidence and the knowledge that he was not alone. Camilla felt a deep satisfaction as she observed the change in Charles, understanding that their family had evolved into something stronger and more resilient. The moment of crisis had revealed new possibilities for supporting each other, creating foundations that would serve them well in the difficult times that surely lay ahead. She had found in Kate not a rival, but a partner, someone equally committed to Charles's well-being and equally capable of providing the varied types of support he needed to fulfill his role while preserving his humanity.